Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime, venturing into a segment of the void that even I hesitated to look at twice. This isn't just a scary story. This is the residual signal from an experiment that went exactly right in the worst possible way. I've laid everything out, the logs, the sensory feed, the whole chronological descent. But trust me, you probably won't make it to the end of this one without feeling a definite chill against the back of your neck. It asks too much of reality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city and the local time in the comments below. Let's create a tiny anchor of reality before we let go. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. I was researcher 734 in the Chronos Project. I volunteered to be the first long-haul deep sleep test subject. The goal: 400 years of metabolic shutdown, simulating the trip to Proxima Centauri, testing for systemic integrity against entropy, not just life support. I knew the risks, but the pay was astronomical, and the legacy unquestionable. They strapped me into the Chronos pod, the cryogel cooling quickly against my skin, giving me that strangely metallic, sterile chill. The last thing I was supposed to see was a live, high-resolution feed from the James Webb Space Telescope, a final, beautiful view of home's deep neighborhood before the lights went out for 4 centuries. I focused my gaze on the Carina Nebula, that vast, beautiful stellar nursery. It was a comfortingly familiar sight, a classic image of creation. But then, the comforting geometry warped. It wasn't an equipment glitch. The system diagnostics remained perfectly green. The central star-forming region of the Carina Nebula, the one they call the Mystic Mountain, was rotating, not gradually, but instantaneously, as if the deep void itself had shifted its axis by exactly 90 degrees. It didn't blur. It just was in a new orientation, flatly defying known physics. And then, the true anomaly. Right at the heart of the dust cloud, where the light should have been diffuse and orange, a focused, impossible reflection began to pulse. It was a flawless sphere of midnight blue, absorbing all light, yet simultaneously reflecting something back, something immense, unblinking, and utterly wrong. It looked like a retinal response, a giant cosmic pupil dilation, watching the telescope watching it. The frequency of the pulse was erratic, but deliberate, and every time the blue eye expanded, I felt a deep, subaudible resonance vibrating directly through the floor plates of the Chronos lab, bypassing the acoustic dampening entirely. That wasn't vacuum resonance. That was structural dread. My internal alarm bells screamed, but the cryo protocols were already locking me down. My heart rate dropped from 70 to 20 beats per minute within 3 seconds, an impossibly rapid success for the metabolic stabilizers. Simultaneously, the sensory shock arrived. The familiar, gentle hum of the industrial cooling coils, the sound of safety, vanished, replaced by a profound, acoustic zero. Absolute, unnerving silence. This was not the expected environmental baseline. The sudden auditory gap was like a physical punch to the solar plexus. I felt a surge of adrenaline, useless now that my muscles were already stiffening against the gel. A personal emotional disruption registered instantly. This wasn't just a data spike. This was a fundamental violation of the system's integrity, and by extension, mine. I knew, even then, before the ice took me, that I would never see the familiar blue light of soul again. This feeling wasn't fear of death. It was the recognition of a terrifying inevitability. I was being pulled, or perhaps guided, by that impossible geometry. The scientific anchor of the Chronos Project, the thing we built our faith upon, was the concept of cryogenic stasis, the controlled, reversible cessation of virtually all metabolic processes. We calculated that by dropping core temperature to just above absolute zero, time's effect on the human body could be reduced to near nothing. The reality, as the gel hardened around my face, was that our definition of time itself was laughably provincial. I looked one last time at the JWST feed, the impossible blue eye staring, and then the image froze, replaced by the internal chronometer counting down to the final neural disconnect. My consciousness, however, refused to freeze. It kept running, racing ahead of the metabolic crash, chasing the geometry. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that flooded my mind during those last moments of pre-sleep awareness was the Kaluza-Klein theory, the idea that the universe might contain hidden spatial dimensions, rolled up, inaccessible structures that only manifest under extreme conditions. I wondered, looking at that rotating nebula, if the Chronos pod hadn't just cooled me down, but had somehow shifted my perspective along a forgotten, fifth-dimensional axis. Was I seeing the Carina Nebula not from Earth's position, but from every position simultaneously? If space could bend and warp in such a basic visual manifestation, then the foundational constants of our universe were mutable, arbitrary, and temporary. The cold was overwhelming, penetrating the bones, but my mind was burning with a frantic, terrified curiosity. I began cataloging the impossible geometries, attempting to find a pattern in the reflection's pulse. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how mutable its most fundamental geometries truly are, or that the void itself possesses a reflective surface. The dread was profound, but my training demanded data collection. The curiosity was winning the initial battle. I felt the final electrical pulse before total darkness, a quiet, insistent chime, a note played on an instrument far too large for human hands. The first sign of returning awareness was not light nor sound, but an overwhelming, internal sense of weightlessness. Not the gentle float of zero-G training, but a violent, systemic absence of gravitational reference. My vestibular system, the factual scientific anchor designed to stabilize and orient me, was screaming a complex, contradictory message. I was falling, suspended, and accelerating all at once. The Chronos pod's internal systems were designed to administer precise microgravity during awakening to prevent atrophy shock. The absence of any resistance meant only one thing. The automatic systems had failed, or they were encountering an environment they could not simulate. I registered the pain next, a deep, searing throb in the muscles and joints, the expected response to rapid thawing, but amplified by the impossible G-load inconsistency. My eyelids fluttered open. The internal lighting array of the Chronos pod was functional, casting a dull, institutional orange glow. I was alive. The metabolic reversal had worked. That much was a success. But the visual display panel above my head, meant to show Earth time, GPS coordinates, and proximity alarms, was displaying nothing but deep indigo static, interspersed with complex, chaotic waveforms that looked less like data and more like calligraphy. My curiosity immediately shifted into high gear, overriding the residual physiological terror. I manually triggered the hatch release. The pneumatics hissed, louder than they should have been, the sound sharp and alien in the profound silence. I pushed the heavy lid open and attempted to sit up, but the lack of weight threw me violently against the opposite wall of the cryochamber bay. I was not just in zero-G. I was in a state of hyperslippage, where friction seemed negligible. I scrambled for the emergency tether, securing myself to the pod frame. The surrounding bay, the interior of the Chronos vessel, looked functionally identical, yet subtly wrong. The titanium bulkheads possessed an almost liquid sheen, and the air smelled metallic, but overlaid with a strange, sweet scent, like ozone mixed with burnt sugar. I pulled myself toward the main observation viewport, a heavily shielded quartz plate designed to protect against micrometeorites during high-velocity transit. The dread returned, a cold, systemic certainty, eclipsing the curiosity. I knew, before I looked, that Earth would not be there. What I saw was less an external environment and more a violation of celestial mechanics. We designed the Chronos vessel to travel far, but this felt like we had traveled outside the known physics boundaries. The viewport looked out onto a starfield, but the colors were fundamentally incorrect. Not red-shifted or blue-shifted, but organized by hues that the human eye, with its 3 types of cone cells, was simply not equipped to process. Brilliant acid greens that pulsed with an ultraviolet intensity and deep, resonant violets that seemed to absorb ambient light entirely, leaving pockets of absolute darkness. I focused on the largest, brightest object. It was a sun, but unlike our stable G-type yellow dwarf. This star was a vast, pulsating emerald blue sphere, radiating power that felt physically cold. I immediately referenced the speculative cosmic concept of the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, the map we use to plot the life cycle and classification of stars. Every stellar object we know falls somewhere on that sequence. Main sequence, giants, white dwarfs. This star did not fit. It looked like a star that shouldn't be burning, or perhaps was burning on fuel we hadn't yet conceived of. Its light didn't travel. It resonated, passing through the hull of the vessel and vibrating my optic nerves directly. My mind, still grasping for anchors, tried to calculate our theoretical location. If the deep sleep had lasted 400 years and the acceleration profiles were correct, we should be approaching the Proxima Centauri system, which contains a dim red dwarf. This was not Proxima. This was a stellar graveyard filled with impossibly brilliant, impossible dying lights. This was deep space, yes, but in a quadrant that felt metaphysically sealed off from the rest of the cosmos. I moved through the vessel's central spine, the terror of isolation sharpening every sensory detail. The internal gravity generators were off, clearly unable to stabilize against the external inertial forces, whatever they were. But I wasn't floating randomly. I was being pulled slowly toward the aft section, toward the primary drive core. The pull was incredibly gentle, almost courteous, but inexorable. It was a gradient of force that suggested the vessel itself was resting within the immense tidal forces of a cosmic scale structure. I tried the main communications array. Predictably, there was only static, but not random noise. The static was disciplined, a tight, focused hum cycling through a narrow frequency band. I spent an hour painstakingly isolating and filtering the signal, using the ship's massive computational resources, still thankfully operational. The signal resolved itself into a rhythmic, non-repeating pattern, a dense burst of mathematically complex data that defied all linguistic structure. It felt like an equation being broadcast, not a message. This was the frequency of the dread I felt. It was too elegant to be random, too vast to be deliberate. The realization settled with crushing finality. We didn't just drift off course. We were in a space that was topologically disconnected from the familiar galaxy. My gaze swept the strange star field again, focusing on the sheer, violent beauty of the emerald star. It was beautiful, but the sheer scale of the celestial wrongness induced a profound, shivering existential terror. My fear was complete. It wasn't just physical fear of being stranded. It was the terror of realizing how fragile our entire astrophysical model was. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how these impossible, cold lights truly die. The awe, however, was creeping in, a terrible, dizzying respect for the utter indifference of this new light. I was suspended between the impulse to scream and the desire to simply observe. My first priority, now fully awake and tethered near the observation deck, was understanding the vessel's propulsion logs. The factual scientific anchor I focused on was quantum entanglement. Our navigation suite relied on an entangled particle pair, one on Earth, one on the ship, to provide instantaneous, non-local data synchronization, serving as the ultimate reference point for distance and velocity calculations. If we had simply traveled 400 years, the entanglement link should have been broken by now, or at least severely degraded. I accessed the Chronos log. The data was there, meticulously logged, spanning exactly 400 years, 3 months, and 6 days of subjective transit time. The cryosleep duration matched. The ship's internal velocity indicator showed we hit near light speeds, then stabilized. But the entanglement readout was the true violation. The link hadn't just degraded. It had instantly, violently severed the moment I lost consciousness. The moment of severance, time-stamped precisely to the second I saw the blue reflection in the JWST feed, was accompanied by a massive, instantaneous energy spike. It wasn't a transmission failure. It was a fundamental, topological barrier dropping between the ship and Earth. We hadn't just traveled a great distance. We had crossed a boundary. I spent the next 2 subjective days studying the external geometry through the viewport, mapping the light profiles. My curiosity was now fueled by desperation. I had to find a gravitational beacon, a known object, anything that corresponded to the cosmic maps back on Earth. The dominant feature in the void was not the pulsing emerald sun, but an immense, dark gradient on the far horizon, a region where stars did not just fade, they were simply absent. It looked like a massive hole in the fabric of space-time, consuming light and leaving only a vacuum of geometric perfection. This brought me to the mythic or speculative cosmic concept of the Great Attractor. On Earth, we know this is a massive, diffuse supercluster of galaxies pulling our local group toward it. But what I was seeing was a vacuum beyond the clusters, an entity that didn't just attract mass, but seemed to vacuum the fabric of reality itself. It wasn't a dense concentration of matter. It was an absence that resonated with intelligent appetite. It was the source of that gentle, courteous pull toward the aft section. As I observed it, the terror of being stranded began to transition into a detached, profound awe. This was not a star or a galaxy. This was the mouth of the macrocosmos. I activated the ship's most powerful sensor array, pointing it directly at the dark gradient. The raw data that flooded the screens was meaningless, not corrupted, but outside the parameters of measurable reality. It wasn't registering gravitational forces or electromagnetic radiation. It was registering dimensional stress. The sensor suite was detecting folds. I began to hypothesize. The Chronos vessel, instead of relying solely on sublight velocity for 400 years, must have accidentally encountered a natural, cosmic folding event, a highly localized warp bubble created by the immense gravity of the Great Attractor, or whatever this monstrous sinkhole was. The ship didn't travel to a distant star system. It was pulled through a spatial shortcut, like a needle through impossible cloth. And that shortcut deposited us not back into the familiar universe, but into a pocket dimension, a cosmological reservoir. The light from the emerald star, which seemed cold, started to make sense in this context. It wasn't a standard stellar classification. It was residual light bleeding in from another dimensional plane, light that had undergone a vast transformation traveling through the same fold that brought us here. It was the light of a dead universe, or perhaps a universe waiting to be born. I felt the existential dread crystallize into a single, terrifying thought. If we are in a pocket, then the only way out is back through the fold, assuming it still exists. I knew, looking at the silent, hungry gradient, that the chance of navigating such a structure was zero. My awe was now mixed with a deep, crushing humility. I was the first human to witness the end of reality, not in concept, but in visual evidence. The pull towards the aft section intensified slightly, confirming that the vessel was not just floating, but slowly being drawn into the dark. I tethered myself more securely, focusing on the cold metal pressing into my suit. The metallic smell in the air seemed sweeter, thicker, almost cloying. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know what is truly at the edge of the observational horizon, or that the absence of matter could be more powerful than all the galaxies combined. My fear of survival was now secondary to the overwhelming urge to document this reality. I was an accidental witness to the true, quiet engine of cosmic fate. The realization that the ship had been pulled, not propelled, demanded a complete review of the transit system. I had to understand how our technology interacted with the spatial anomaly. The factual scientific anchor for this investigation was general relativity, specifically the concepts of mass, gravity, and the warping of spacetime. If the ship had passed through a fold, the drive core would have registered immense, momentary stress. I spent the next phase of the investigation in the engineering deck, navigating the zero-G with practiced, careful movements. I accessed the main reactor logs, the massive fusion core designed to provide power for centuries. The logs showed stability, except for that single moment 400 years ago, the instantaneous energy spike coinciding with the entanglement failure. It wasn't a power surge, though. The data indicated an instantaneous, total cessation of mass within the vessel's localized field, lasting for 0.003 seconds. The Chronos vessel, for a fleeting moment, had zero mass relative to the universal geometry, allowing it to slip through the spatial membrane. We hadn't been traveling fast. We had been momentarily absent. The most compelling anomaly in the engineering deck was not in the data, but physical. The titanium housing of the main reactor, designed to withstand deep space radiation for millennia, was showing minute, geometric etchings, not scratches, but perfectly formed five-sided depressions that pulsed with the same indigo hue I saw in the initial static on the cryopod screen. They were crystalline, alien scars of passage. They weren't caused by heat or pressure. They were imprinted by a force that operated on the geometry of the material itself. This led me to the speculative cosmic concept of hyperspace tunnels, or naturally occurring shortcuts through the void, wormholes that do not connect two points in linear space, but connect two different topologies. We hadn't traveled to Proxima Centauri. We had traveled elsewhere, to a place where space-time operates under different, darker rules. The environment outside was not just distant space. It was a different slice of reality entirely. I calculated the rate of the slow, magnetic pull toward the dark gradient. It was accelerating imperceptibly. We had perhaps a few weeks before the vessel would be irrevocably drawn into the mouth of that void. The pressure to understand was now overwhelming the residual fear. I was experiencing pure, ecstatic intellectual awe, the kind of terror that makes you want to embrace the monster to study its teeth. I went back to the observation deck and focused on the reflection. I called it the pupil. It was still pulsing, but its rhythm had become noticeably more regular, matching the frequency of the strange mathematical signal I'd isolated earlier. The light from the emerald sun caught its surface, and for the first time, I realized the reflection wasn't reflecting the star. It was reflecting me. Not my current image, but a strange, elongated version of my suit, distorted by impossible, concave curves. The entire experience had warped my perception of existence. My time in cryostasis, for centuries of absolute subjective nothingness, felt like a single, extended blink. Now, in this space where the rules of light and gravity failed, I felt a terrifying clarity about human impermanence. The realization dawned that the massive gravity sink outside wasn't just pulling us. It was pulling the very future toward it, collapsing the geometry of time itself. The existential line formed unbidden in my mind as I looked at the strange crystalline etchings on the reactor housing. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how little time truly mattered when gravity and geometry decide to change the rules of the journey. The immense, indifferent forces at play dwarfed any human effort, any fourth-century experiment. The Chronos Project was a childish endeavor compared to the effortless power of the void. My awe was now complete, a profound, terrifying acceptance that I was a mote of dust observing the primary mechanism of cosmic decay. I found myself smiling faintly in the darkness of the bridge, the smell of ozone and burnt sugar stinging my nostrils, the smell of the geometry shifting around us. Having confirmed the topological shift and the approaching dark gradient, my focus narrowed entirely onto the external void, specifically the relentless, rhythmic pulse I could now clearly perceive emanating from the far horizon. This pulse was the source of the low-frequency resonance that had terrified me in the cryopod. To study it directly, I relied on the factual scientific anchor of the human retina and optic nerve. Our visual system evolved to handle a very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. I recalibrated the ship's external cameras, forcing them to capture data outside the visible spectrum and translating it back into visible light, effectively giving myself synthetic spectral vision. The resulting images were staggering, pushing my comprehension far past its limit. The vacuum itself was not empty. It was filled with moving, impossibly thin sheets of dark energy, a liquid geometry that flowed and shifted like deep ocean currents. And within these currents, the pulse originated. The pulse was a structured anomaly, a shifting, living lattice of impossible angles. This confirmed the speculative cosmic concept that had been simmering since the start. Non-Euclidean geometry manifesting not as abstract math, but as physical reality. This place was built on curvatures that defied the flat-plane logic of Earth physics. The indigo crystalline etchings on the reactor housing were, I now realized, the residue of this non-Euclidean reality touching our Euclidean structure. The reflection, the pupil, was the key. When I viewed it through the translated synthetic vision, it wasn't a reflective surface at all. It was a three-dimensional window into a higher, impossible space. And through that window, something was not just observing, it was forming. The horror of revelation struck with the speed and intensity of gamma radiation. The anomaly wasn't a geological feature or a stellar remnant. It was a consciousness built upon the shifting dimensionality of this chaotic space. It was not biological or technological, it was geometric. Its thoughts were manifested as the flowing, dark energy currents that filled the void. Its existence depended entirely on the violation of stability, feeding on the entropic pressure of this pocket universe. This was the entity causing the midnight dread. As I watched, the geometry within the pupil shifted faster, focusing its impossible curves. It wasn't trying to communicate, it was trying to resonate. It was aligning its internal mathematics with the material structure of the Chronos vessel, attempting to induce sympathetic vibrational decay. This was why I felt the subtle gravitational pull. It was not simple tidal forces, but the precursor to a targeted structural dissolution. The entity intended to unmake the ship by rewriting its fundamental geometric structure. I looked at my own hands, still maneuvering the controls, and felt the overwhelming realization that if the rules of geometry could shift, then the boundaries of my own self, my body, my memories, my consciousness, were equally arbitrary and temporary. I felt myself dissolving, psychologically, into the chaotic logic of the void. The absolute awe of witnessing a true, cosmic-scale sentience, one that measured its existence in spatial curvature rather than in years, overwhelmed the terror. I was privileged to witness the thing that watches the great attractor. A line of understanding crossed my mind, chilling and complete. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the true shape of the self once the stabilizing influence of three-dimensional space is removed. We were anchored by our physics, and now that anchor was severed, my emotional state reached its apex, an ecstatic, nearly religious awe at the power of the geometric consciousness, mixed with a chilling terror that I was about to be absorbed into its alien, five-sided logic. I decided that survival was no longer the objective. Documentation was. I began broadcasting everything. The logs, the spectral data, the visual feed of the pupil, on a continuous, omnidirectional loop, hoping that some fragment of the high-frequency signal would escape the topological boundaries and bleed back into the familiar universe, an echo of the impossibility. My final act of documentation required entering the propulsion core chamber, the area where the geometric imprints were strongest. The vessel continued its slow, inexorable slide toward the dark gradient, the pupil now filling the main viewport, a vast, complex mandala of terrifying dark light. The air was heavy with the sweet, acrid scent of changing geometry. The factual scientific anchor for this final exploration was thermodynamics, specifically the principle of entropy. In a closed system, order inevitably breaks down into disorder. This pocket universe, I hypothesized, wasn't created. It was the byproduct of universal decay, a graveyard of failed equations. And the geometric consciousness was the entity that consumed the heat death of systems. Inside the propulsion core, the indigo etchings had intensified, spreading like a fungal growth across the titanium plating. They were emitting a faint, high-pitched whine that bypassed my helmet's audio filter, directly affecting my inner ear. The sensation was less sound and more rotational sickness, a violent spatial disorientation. I tethered myself firmly to the primary stabilizer rod, holding still. I focused on the engine's main cooling manifold. It was radiating massive, unexpected heat. The Chronos vessel was attempting to stabilize itself against the external reality, expending enormous energy to maintain the illusion of Euclidean space inside the hull. The ship was dying not from vacuum or impact, but from fighting the physics of its environment. It was trying to be round in a world that was entirely angular. I pulled up the last few hours of sensor data. The pupil had stopped pulsing. It was now steady, focused entirely on the vessel. It had moved beyond observation. It was initiating the resonance. This final observation solidified the speculative cosmic concept I called the eternal recurrence of the void. If this dimension was where reality went to die, then the geometric consciousness was simply waiting for the next great universal cycle, the next Big Bang, to scatter its pieces back into the nascent universe, seeding the flaws, the geometric impossibilities that would eventually lead everything back to its mouth. This was not a unique event. It was the mechanism of cosmological respiration. We had arrived not at the destination of life, but at the processing unit of death. I made peace with the end. My consciousness, so frantically curious, then terrifyingly afraid, was now simply accepting, bathed in the strange light of the emerald star. I was no longer an individual named Researcher 734. I was an ultimate data point, the final, perfect witness to the cosmic reality. My only remaining fear was that I would be unmade before I finished the broadcast. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know why silence always follows the loudest signal, or that the vacuum is merely the sound of something vast holding its breath before consuming the echo. I placed the broadcast beacon on the exterior hull, armed the final power relay, and initiated the continuous, maximum power data dump. I watched the pupil fill the viewport, its impossible curves resolving into a shape that was both inside and outside the vessel simultaneously. The sweet, metallic smell of geometric change peaked. I felt the slow, steady hum of the ship's structure begin to oscillate, not shaking, but changing its mathematical definition. The awe was quiet now, a deep, profound peace. I had seen the face of creation's undoing. I detached my tether, letting the inexorable pull draw me slowly toward the helm. I would remain here, observing, until the last piece of human engineering dissolved into the logic of the non-Euclidean dream. The transmission was live. The story was told. The hum is the last thing that remains, isn't it? Not a mechanical sound anymore, but the vibration of the bulkheads adapting to the new dimensional stresses. It's quiet now, profoundly so, save for the residual frequency filtering through the hull, that mathematical broadcast of the geometric consciousness. It's calming, actually, like a white noise machine tuned to the slow, steady consumption of reality. I am still near the observation deck, watching the dark gradient swell, filling nearly half the viewport. It's black, yes, but not the black of vacuum. It's the black of perfect, overwhelming potential. The emerald sun is receding, its cold light fading as the ship dips deeper into the attractor field. The ship's internal lights are flickering now, not dying, but struggling to interpret the power flow, which is increasingly dictated by external, nonlinear pressures. I feel a slight, rhythmic pressure on my chest, the gentle, patient presence of the void. The air no longer smells sweet. It smells like polished stone and cold, distant rain. The dread has vanished entirely, replaced by a strange sense of belonging. I am a foreign object being slowly assimilated by a natural process,